Welcome, I'm Carol Jenkins, Executive Director of Cystic Fibrosis Research Incorporated, or CFRI. This CF Discovery Series was developed in collaboration with Camille Wasowich, nurse practitioner at Stanford at CF Adult Clinic. It was designed to make vital CF information accessible to the CF community. Before beginning, I'd like to note that no information presented tonight is intended for a patient's diagnosis or treatment. As always, we urge you to work together with your healthcare team for your medical treatment. Tonight, we're looking forward to our presentation on kindness to self, a CF caregiver's guide. Thanks to Genentech and to Respirtech for supporting this important evening. Their support pays for the venue and the refreshments, the studio we've constructed here, and other costs associated with the program. Tonight, this program is being produced by your CFRI Live team, Eric Martin, Scott Wakefield, David Suhu, and Joanne Davis, who is tracking questions from our online participants. We are live at the Crowne Plaza Cabana Hotel in Palo Alto, California, and I encourage you all to ask questions, whether you're here in the audience or part of our online community. Hello especially to those of you who may be in the hospital. We're so glad that you can join us tonight. In keeping with our cross-infection guidelines, we've asked the guests in the studio who have CF not attend if they've ever cultured B. cepacia or if they've had MRSA within the past 2 years. We have provided hygiene kits for the health of all. And finally, we ask that those with CF not handle the serving tongs for food that we've provided, thanks to our volunteers Danielle and Suda for serving our refreshments. I've met Jim Mulvaney, who is working with Cara rather recently, and I'm so glad to get to know both him and the organization. He's been involved in caregiver support for a long time, as he will share with you. He's here tonight not only for caregivers, but for all of us in the CF community. Please give a warm welcome to Jim Mulvaney.
Thank you, Carol. It's a privilege to be with you here this evening to explore this important topic. We tend to think of kindness as something that we show to others. Tonight, we'll be taking a look at kindness to self. During the presentation, please feel free to make a comment, raise your hand, ask a question. First, I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to CARA. CARA is a nonprofit providing emotional support for grief and end of life since 1976. We provide peer support with individual counseling as well as group. These services are offered for no fee and for donation only. We also provide grief-related therapy for fee. We provide support for individuals as well as families. An example of that is Camp Erin over the summer, when we have a 3-day weekend that children from ages of 7 through 17 can come and both enjoy the activities of a camp, but also share with others about their grief. We provide community crisis response for schools and corporations and other agencies. Community education, this is an example of what we're doing tonight, as well as professional training, especially for caregivers, doctors, nurses, chaplains, hospice care workers, and so forth. Our clients include individuals, families, professional and family caregivers, first responders, organizations. So my own journey took me to CARA in January of 2001. Prior to that, I had been involved in high tech, first electrical engineering, then advanced information technology applications, and I had been running my own web development business since 1994. What brought me to CARA was the sudden death of my wife, Claudia. Completely unexpected, and as you can imagine, quite a shock. And it was a neighbor who shared with me about CARA as an organization and that I should check them out. I was a client for a peer counselor for about 1 year before I closed. And after that, probably about 6 or 8 months later, I was invited to take Cara's training to become a volunteer peer counselor. And at the time, that felt very right, not only to perhaps support those who were going through grief and end of life, but also for my own continued healing. So it was quite an opportunity, and I've never regretted it. Since then, I've held a number of positions at Cara, and currently I'm the Director of Training and Education. So a little bit about my caregiving experience. Well, probably the first experience I had of that was receiving care from my peer counselor at Cara. And then as a volunteer and staff member of Cara, providing emotional support for grief and end of life as a counselor and as a group facilitator since 2002. In 2006, I went through a wonderful program by the Meta Institute called End of Life Practitioner. And that was a 1-year program of monthly retreats where we delved into not just the logistical, but very much the human and the emotional and the spiritual and all these other dimensions of what it means to approach end of life and what it means to be a caregiver for those who are. Ironically, at the end of that program, I was diagnosed with cancer myself. And this was esophageal cancer. I was told that I had about a 5% chance of surviving the first 2 years. And it was, as you can imagine, quite a shift and a change in my life. And in fact, I would say probably that experience going through that kind of care, both the family and neighbors who helped me, as well as the professional caregivers, really put caregiving in general on the radar for me as a professional at Cara providing support services. And since then, I've been helping Cara to focus on supporting caregivers, both the professional and the family and friend caregivers. That includes managing and facilitating for several years the Cara Professional Caregivers Group. And most importantly, my clients over the years have taught me so much about their experiences of caregiving and some of the challenges that they have experienced. So tonight I'll be talking about themes of caregiving that relate really to any caregiver of any situation, but particularly I hope to make it relevant to CF caregivers. So before I begin to get into these issues, I guess I have to confess that I am not a CF expert. So don't ask me details about CF itself, but thanks to Carol and CFRI's website, I have been able to get somewhat educated as to some of the key issues that CF patients and caregivers must deal with. And I have to say I was unprepared, really, for the formidable challenges and issues that these families face. And it came up in my mind more than once, how could anything I say help those who are facing such a difficult circumstance? So I guess we'll have to see about that. So first, at a high level, caregiver issues tend to fall under these 3 areas. Exhaustion. Things like 2 sets of meals. Managing medications. Breathing treatments. Doctor's visits. Tube feedings. Sterilization. Working with insurance companies, I understand, is particularly hair-raising for a CF family. Isolation. The family may not know others who are challenged with CF, so there's no contact, no guidance, no one who's been there before that can give them some feedback, some guidance. Cross-infection issues in particular can provide a factor of isolation. And thirdly, self-esteem can come from many sources. Lack of recognition for what the caregiver is actually contributing and providing, the challenges that the caregiver is going through. That's tough when no one can see that, no one understands that and appreciates it. fear of making mistakes. And there are so many complications with CF. Mistakes are bound to happen sooner or later. And how we deal with that can either be kind or not. And then there's the fact that this is a declining illness. Even if we were able to provide perfect care, the end does not change. Family caregiver challenges can include these. Needs are often overlooked or ignored. When the physical requirements of the one with CF has the paramount attention of everyone, it is so easy to overlook the needs of other family members. As I mentioned, contributions are not recognized or acknowledged. Difficulties faced are not understood. In fact, I understand from Carol this is sometimes called the silent disease, that people don't even see visibly that there's something going on there. Criticism can be especially difficult to deal with. The criticism from others, but especially the criticism from ourselves. Limited time for self, anxieties of all kinds, and little or no support. So an organization like CFRI, providing these kinds of services, is absolutely precious. And then there is dealing with grief. Not just the grief associated with the ultimate death, but the grief all along the way of losing capabilities, of seeing and experiencing suffering, of gradually losing your loved one. And grief can impact us on all levels. Mentally, confusion, intrusive images and memories, diminished capacity for decision-making, problem-solving, and concentrating. I can remember in the first months after Claudia died, I was not really able to wrap my mind around the complexities of my business. A lot of it was analytical, complex series of steps. Even billing became a challenge for me. Emotionally, volatility, shock and numbness, anxiety, irritability, sad, moody, anger, emptiness, guilt and regret, a feeling of helplessness and being overwhelmed, apathy, grief. Any of this sound familiar? No. Physically, our sleep can be impacted, appetite. We can experience shortness of breath, fatigue, tension. We can be susceptible to illness and pre-existing conditions. Socially, I mentioned before the isolation and the withdrawal, and there can be relationship issues. When the family is going through the difficulties of dealing with CF, often friends and broader family can feel uncomfortable being very involved with that. So they may withdraw and create some distance in protecting themselves. They may also be concerned that they have really nothing to offer in such a challenging situation. And that disconnect, we have a little dog here for those of you on the web. So moving on to behavioral, it can impact things like hyperactivity, impatience, and we can sometimes self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. Spiritually, questions can come up around beliefs, the search for meaning, anger at God, and confronting our own mortality and vulnerability. This is a lot to deal with, and thank goodness it usually doesn't all happen at once. But all of these areas might be experienced at some time or other with those who are going through CF with a loved one. Any questions or comments at this point? Yes?
So are you, I'm sorry, I need to just hop up to my. A-okay. So by listing these, would it be normal to be experiencing some of these things? As a caregiver,
Oh, yes.
some folks with CF, people are living longer lives, but there's still these ups and downs and ups and downs, and I can relate to different aspects of that, and I'm a little reassured that that's normal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's important to acknowledge that these impacts can happen, because when we think they're not supposed to happen, what do? We criticize ourselves and make it even worse. So a little bit about compassion and caregiving. I don't know about you, but somehow I grew up with the belief that I can be kind to someone else, but if I focus on myself, that somehow that's being selfish, and that I'm then ignoring others who may need my help. Well, I've found that exactly the opposite is true. The more you are able to treat yourself kindly, the more kindness and help you will be able to offer to another. And this quote from Daniel Goleman in his book, Emotional Intelligence, kind of reinforces that. The internal work and external work of caregiving are the same. The more you can develop the internal ability to be a calm, compassionate presence toward yourself, the more you can bring that presence to everyone that you serve.
You know what you said right there?
Yes.
Right on the money. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, please.
No, I was just saying what you said about being taught that if you take a moment for yourself, you're being selfish.
Yes.
It's exactly how I feel. And that was my New Year's resolution this year, to think about myself a little bit more. Because you're right, the better I feel, the better I am, the better I'll be to help whoever I'm helping.
I'm so glad to hear
Yeah.
that.
It's hard to do that.
It is, especially it's hard when we're in the habit of doing exactly the opposite. We really don't have the experience and the practice, the pattern of giving ourselves that kind of loving attention. And yet it's critical in our caregiving.
And it makes you feel guilty to take a moment to yourself
Yeah.
when the other person is not feeling well.
Yeah, yes.
It's hard to say, well, I'm going to go, get a mani-pedi now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So before we begin to explore this theme more deeply, I'd like to emphasize our purpose tonight is to raise our awareness about how we can treat ourselves with kindness. It is not about criticizing ourselves for our lack of skill in doing this, nor is it about adding a bunch of tasks to an already overflowing to-do list. So please relax, take in whatever feels relevant to you, ignore the rest. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of the kindness or the unkindness that we're talking about. Unkindness towards self happens through how we schedule our time, how we push our bodies, including lack of sleep, how we compare and judge ourselves against others, how we surrender to too many demands, commit to too many projects, how we want to help everyone and everything, well-meaning, but not necessarily kind, how we go about arranging our lives, and in particular, how we disregard signals of imbalance over the long term. Now, certainly dealing with CF, there are crises and emergencies that come up and we have to push. We have to really fire on all cylinders for a while. But hopefully, we do have that time of respite, of bringing it back down to a more normal level. We can push through those times effectively, I think, as caregivers. But if there's no end to it, there's nothing for us to do but gradually burn out. So what are the ways that we can practice kindness? The next several slides will address how we can be kinder to ourselves. Again, this is not meant to be a laundry list for you to add to your own to-do list. Not all of these suggestions may be helpful or relevant to your situation. Please trust your own intuition about what might be truly helpful to you. So, practicing kindness towards self. Leave time for the quietness of simply being present with yourself. How long has it been since you experienced that? And we tend to think of having large blocks of time to be able to have respite and take care of ourselves. It can happen in minutes. It can happen in moments. One of the ways that I was kind to myself coming here tonight was I realized I was addressing a topic that was rather formidable. I truly have felt challenged by this. So I did a few things that I knew would reduce stress and be kind to myself. So I left 15 minutes early. When I came here, I parked, I sat in my car, meditated for about 15 minutes, and then I came in here. By practicing these things historically, I've observed the positive effects that they have on me. And I make sure that I do these little things that are under my control, that I can do no matter how busy I am. So it's these kinds of things that I hope you'll be able to find in this presentation tonight. Practice noticing when you are wanting things to be different than the way they are. I know that must rarely happen to you. No, I'm wrong? Okay. Of course, especially dealing with something like CF. And yet, when we fight what is, it adds to our suffering. It adds to our load. Question your beliefs and judgments that may be adding to the challenge. One example of that is the belief that I should be able to control the stormy situations in my life. And there's lots of stormy situations with CF, aren't there? So if I'm believing that I have to be able to control and manage that, I'm going to suffer even more. Because the reality is, sometimes it just can't be controlled. Do just what has to be done right now. That's all I can do right now. I don't know about you, but my background is planning, so I'm used to thinking forward in the future a lot. And I kind of grew up with the belief that if I could predict the stuff that would be happening in the future, then I could control it, manage it, and be okay. Well, this is a double-edged sword. First of all, if I haven't experienced yet, I'm probably not imagining the reality of what it really would be. The other thing is, if I keep going into the future, I can scare myself with all kinds of possibilities and take myself out of the present moment, which is the only place that I can truly be a caregiver for myself and others. Feel free to comment or question as I go along. Any questions so far or comments?
The author, you quoted a few books there.
Yes. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later, but in particular, these points about noticing when we don't like the way things are and looking at our beliefs and judgments about how things are. This book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is, I strongly recommend. And in that book, she presents a little technique called the work that helps one, I would say, get outside of the grip of the beliefs and judgments that may be running us and question them and to see what's really true about them. So that's a process that is helpful for just about any aspect of life, but in particular, going through the challenges that a CF family has to go through. It's even more important that we're able to sometimes stand outside of it and take a look and inquire. At the end, I'll give you some links to further information about that as well. One important area is self-forgiveness. I mentioned when talking about the impacts of grief, some of the things were irritability and anger and resentment and all kinds of things. And when these come up, we tend to feel guilty. How could I feel guilty about this situation? My poor child is going through this. How could I feel guilty? So not only are we in pain about the situation, but we're adding suffering on top of that about what naturally arises in these situations. Not very kind. So self-forgiveness for whatever comes up, frustration and anger and regrets, resentments, mistakes. What are some other practices that might have been helpful to you that you've noticed? Any suggestions? Okay. A little bit more about working with our beliefs and judgments. And this is the area that Byron Katie's work focuses on. The greatest source of caregiver stress and suffering can sometimes be our judgments and beliefs about the situation we're dealing with, about the patient and his or her needs, choices, and preferences, about our own ability to serve and help, and about others providing care. It's helpful to become more skillful at noticing, examining, and questioning these beliefs when they arise. And that's particularly what Byron Katie's approach can help with.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you give an example of the example itself does not have to draw from CF specifically, but just an example of what that would be like for a moment?
I'll give an example from my own counseling. This was not a CF client, but someone who is dealing with a number of conditions that are life-threatening. And this is a client who has been going in and out of the hospital now almost weekly, maybe a few times a month, for the last 6 to 8 months. And it seems like the caregivers are always getting it wrong. They're misdiagnosing, they're making mistakes, and it's upsetting this client quite a bit. And at one point she said to me, I don't think I want to see any more doctors. I don't want to take any of these treatments anymore, and I'm not going to have surgery because I'm a high surgery risk. Now, my immediate reaction, sitting with that client, was, wow, that's not good. You have to follow the doctor's suggestions. Don't give up. Things like that came up for me. So when I went through this process, and I'll just briefly outline the questions, I don't really have the time to go too much in depth, but there are 4 basic questions, starting with the belief that this client should get the surgery, the way the doctors are saying. The first question is it true? Is it true that she should? Well, yeah. If she doesn't, they're saying she's going to die. Second question, can I absolutely know, 100%, that this is true? I still kind of felt pretty solid about the yes, she should get surgery. The third question, how do I react when I believe this thought? This is a real juicy question, because I got to look at how I was reacting, how I was actually leaving the room, going into my head with all these judgments, distancing myself from my client, losing my compassionate presence. All kinds of ways I reacted when I believed that this is true, that she should get the surgery and she's not. The fourth question, how would I be without the thought? Not having the thought and convincing myself otherwise, but really imagining how would I be if it never occurred to me that she should get the surgery because the doctor said so. And what I was able to see as I meditated on that question was that, well, first of all, I would be much more compassionate and understanding of her situation. I would be connected with her, present with her. And I would be actually interested in hearing more about what she had to say about that, really understanding where she was coming from. So those are the 4 questions, and then there's a turnaround. In the turnaround, we take the first statement of belief, my client should get surgery, and we turn it around. So one way of turning it around is, my client shouldn't get surgery. The next step is to look for at least 3 good, solid reasons why that is true, why the opposite of what I was believing actually could be true. And for me, what I came up with was, she is clearly at the end of life. She has so many conditions that could take her at any time. The treatments that are being offered by medical practitioners are fairly brutal. And for her, because of other conditions she had, very high risk. Very high risk of not surviving the surgery. And then there was just the sheer matter that she was so tired of dealing with this for so long. And I began to see the kindness in it. So it didn't necessarily convince me that she should never get surgery, but it opened me up to where she was coming from. It opened me up so that I wasn't so rigidly holding on to my belief that she should get the surgery. So that's just an example of how actually inquiring about what I'm believing in this moment can be helpful, if only to help me see other perspectives. I can actually, going through this, I've been practicing this since 1994. Seen Katie many times, gone to a lot of her events, went through her trainings to become a certified facilitator. And this has just made me so much more flexible and so much more tuned into the fact that most of my beliefs and judgments are anywhere from inaccurate to totally untrue. And once I see that again and again, it's harder for some new belief to come along and get that kind of grip on me where I don't even question it anymore. It's really a freedom that I truly love. So does that help you with a bit of an example? I'll be giving you a link later to the work website, which has all kinds of videos and examples of people doing the work on all kinds of topics, including dying and life-threatening illnesses and so forth. So taking care of myself. Know my own limits. It's important to have realistic expectations of the situation, of the possibilities, and especially of myself. So when I know my own limits, I can be conscious enough to know when I need help. And that's the second thing, ask for help. This can be very difficult. It's so easy to say, but it's not always easy to do. Because what kinds of thoughts come up that would prevent us from asking for help? Anyone have any?
They can't do it like I can.
Can't do it like I can. Exactly, right? Can't be delegated. Good one. What else? Anything else come up for you when you think of asking for help?
They're busy too.
They're busy too, don't want to burden them, right? Okay. What else?
I would say not accepting your own limits. To ask for help means that you reached a part that you need.
Yes, yes. So if I'm not good at accepting the fact that I have limitations, I'm not even going to get to this point. Good one. What else?
I've already asked them several times, so now I'm coming again.
Yes.
It seems like maybe my requests are I'm perceiving them as endless, because here I come again.
Mm-hmm. Some that come up for me is, I should be able to handle this. I should be able to handle this. And I actually experience some shame over the fact that I'm apparently not doing so well. So that's the last thing I want to expose, perhaps, to others. All kinds of reasons for not asking for help, and they often have to do with being in someone else's business, not in our own. So for instance, someone commented, well, I'm not going to ask because that other person might be too busy too. Okay. Well, that's their business. Managing their busyness, saying yes or no to a commitment, that's their business. My business is to simply ask. When I can make that distinction, and it's a practice, it's not something that comes easily because what have we been told to do? What have we been taught to do? What are the examples we've seen all our lives? We're always in other people's business. So it isn't as if we have some good examples in our lives where we can shift that easily. So I like to look at this as a practice, an awareness, and I just notice I get a little bit better over time. Really important, notice the good. When we're in a place of suffering and pain, we can so easily go into the belief that everything is suffering and pain. And we lose sight of those things that we could actually be grateful for. And this lack of balance can cause so much suffering. So notice the good, even the little things. Notice, as we go through this presentation, I hope you will be noticing things you've already been doing on some level or other. And I think it's important that we notice these things because these are skillful. Every time I'm able to observe something in my behavior that's more skillful than it was, that's reassuring. It kind of motivates me to keep going. So notice the good. So no one else is acknowledging your contribution? Acknowledge yourself. You know, and that's something we're also taught not to do. If I acknowledge myself and my contributions, I'm self-aggrandizing, I'm big-headed, all kinds of negative thoughts conjure up over the fact that I might be complimenting myself over something or acknowledging myself for a contribution or achievement. That's not kind. That's just not kind. So acknowledge yourself, even for the small things. How about some others? Anything else occur to you? Taking care of myself.
It's nice when you're acknowledged without doing it yourself. For others to acknowledge you.
Yes, it is nice. I enjoy that when that happens too. But I'm not dependent on it. I don't want to be dependent on it. There's too much suffering in that. Yes.
What about specifically scheduling?
Could you just...
What about specifically scheduling some time for yourself? Because I know it's nice in theory to think about giving yourself a break or finding balance in your life. But are you going to talk a little bit about how people can really fit that into their schedule? Because 24 hours gets away and you look back and you go, I didn't
Yes.
schedule anything for myself. Is that helpful?
We will address it, and that's certainly helpful, but sometimes not possible to do in the way we often think about it, like taking a day off, for instance. I mentioned about the 15 minutes I took to just be quiet with myself before I walked in here. Those are the kinds of things, especially in a challenging caregiving situation, that I find are most helpful because I can almost do it at any time, certainly at least once a day. But that doesn't say I shouldn't also be looking for respite of a larger nature. And that reminds me of a story that a dear friend shared with me. She was going through both grief over the loss of her son, as well as her husband's very challenging and debilitating illness. And she was going to work one day. She worked full-time. She was going to work one day, and she felt this uncontrollable urge to just keep going. Just keep going. She drove all the way to Monterey. She was from this area, the Bay Area. Drove all the way from Monterey and spent a day at the beach in the sun. That, to me, is inspiring. She called in sick, I'm assuming, but she's a responsible person, so she handled what she needed. But it had built up so much for her that that's what came to her. And what I find so inspiring is not that she thought of doing that, it's that she did it. So often we have the intuition and the intelligence and the wisdom within us to know what we need. The question is, can we give that to ourselves? Anything else about taking care of ourselves?
Sometimes it's so unnatural, okay, to take care of yourself without thinking that it's selfish. And I think that we're challenged at different times, should I take some time off? And, realizing that there are responsibilities that are still there.
Yes. It is a challenge, no question about it. So, don't necessarily bite off the big challenges. Look for the smaller opportunities to practice this. And I think with the practice, you'll find that you get better and better at this, and eventually you're maybe able to do some fairly sizable examples of kindness to yourself. Okay. I've talked with so many people, clients, colleagues, and friends over the years. So this is what I call collective wisdom, not just from my own personal experience, but from others. Again, some of this may be helpful to you, some of it may not. Just kind of pick and choose what may be helpful. Make a simple request, accepting a yes or a no without judgment. Okay? Easy to say, huh? We already talked about what can get in the way of just asking for help. And then there's the part of where we're accepting a yes or a no, and if it's a no, there's rejection, there's all kinds of things that come up for us. So this is not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. So practice it. Do it with little stuff. Get used to it. Yes, Carol.
Could you give an example?
Okay, let's see. Well, I remember when I was going for infusions for cancer treatment, and my partner wasn't able to pick me up, but could drop me off. So that left me needing to ask someone to pick me up from the infusion center. And I had a neighbor who could do that. And I just asked, and she was able to do that. In fact, more so than that, she was so happy that she could do something that would be helpful for me. She was concerned about my well-being. The fact that she could do anything that would contribute to supporting me through this was a gift to her. And one of the things I took away from this experience was how it can be a gift to ask, because it gives those around you who are so concerned about your situation something specific that they can do. The other thing I learned about asking, it was a lot easier for me to ask the next time if I showed my gratitude for someone helping me out. So for instance, with this very same neighbor, I just was so grateful to her and spoke to her about how grateful I was for her helping me out in that way. She responded, as probably most of us would, "Oh, it was nothing. It's just 5 minutes down the road." We tend to measure the value of the gift in the cost to the giver, where the real value is in the need that the person who's receiving it has. And I had this need, and I told her that. It has nothing to do with how easy it is for you to drive me down the block. And she saw that. So it helps me to ask when I can allow myself to freely express my appreciation and gratitude. And when I do that sincerely, that comes across to the person who has helped me out. And do you think they're going to be more or less likely to say yes next time? Yeah. So one thing, again, to leave you with is that this is actually a gift to the giver when we are able to ask, whether they're able to say yes or no. Okay, thanks. prioritize. We've talked about all these lists, to-do lists, all the things that I'm presenting here. Don't take it all. Prioritize. Figure out what seems to be the best parts of this that you can begin to practice with. And prioritize in your life. There may be, especially when there are crisis situations, you can't act as if things are normal. It's not business as usual. So prioritize what you can do and drop the rest. Again, getting back to some of the impacts of grief, when I was going through the early months of grief, not only did this affect my business capacity, but also in personal things like paying bills, phone bills and whatnot. And I noticed sometimes I just was not able to sit down and pay the bills. I allowed myself to get late notices. It wasn't that big a deal. I'd pay them later, but in the moment when I was so stressed out, I gave myself some relief. I took a bit of an edge off it. So I followed rules that I never would have followed before. My standard was you always pay your bills. You don't ever have a mark on your credit record. And yet I realized I was in such a situation at that time that I just had to cut myself this extra slack. And the consequences were not that big a deal. But in my mind, I was imagining all kinds of things. Ask, don't guess. This is a big one. How often do we have concerns and expectations, worries about others and how their experience is going and what they're thinking? And we imagine this in our heads, but we don't check it out. We don't actually ask them, how are you doing with this? You know, or I'm concerned about this particular item. How are you dealing with that? Rather than assume it and then respond to what I'm assuming. That's a real good way to burn yourself out. Because you're not necessarily responding to the actual needs of the individual. And I often find that I can worry about stuff that the other person, it's not even on their radar. So ask for the information. Schedule daily time for fun and relaxation. You mentioned scheduling respite and so forth. It can be something like watching a favorite TV show at a certain time. One of the things for me is I make myself a decaf, non-fat latte every morning. It's a ritual. It's the start of my day. It kind of starts me taking good care of myself, sets me off in a good direction. Don't bottle it up. Seek those you can talk to. Well, here's another one that's not necessarily easy, because if you're in a CF family, your family members aren't necessarily the ones who you feel you can talk to about this. They're dealing with enough. And there may also be interactions and complications. So it can be very helpful to have a third party who's not involved in your situation, but who can be a listening ear, understanding, and talk with that person, share what's going on. What we can talk about is manageable. It's the stuff we can't talk about that is so difficult to cope with. And indeed, that's the main value of CARA. CARA is a place that those who are in grief or approaching end of life can come and share all kinds of stuff that's coming up for them with someone who's both understanding and yet not involved. Someone who the client doesn't have to protect by holding back. So I strongly encourage you to seek a friend or some resource, someone that you can talk to and not feel that you have to hold back or take care of them. Anything about that? Get the sleep you need. Boy, this is a tough one because sleep in this situation can be a very iffy thing. It can be interrupted at any time. Just the worry can keep you from sleep. But on the other hand, having inadequate sleep is extremely debilitating, and over a long haul can really be bad for your health and your emotional makeup and everything. And one of the fastest and most effective things you can do to recoup is to get some good sleep. So keep an eye on that and see what you can do that can give you that occasional recoup of some of your sleep. The typical exercise, of course, again, this is not a to-do list. These are just things that can be helpful. Be well informed. We talked about that earlier. CFI is a wonderful example of serving the CF community by providing information, helpful information, factual information. When I have factual information, I'm a lot calmer than when I'm rolling around in my own head with all kinds of fears and possibilities ungrounded in real fact. It's not very kind. Break habits, do things differently. Not because necessarily they're going wrong, but simply because some amount of change and some kind of sense of control or refining things or optimizing things, whether it's a procedure that you need to carry out with the person that you're caring for, or whether it's something else in your life, that can help a little bit to feel that I'm not completely unable to be empowered in my life. Any questions or comments on this? Cultivating well-being. Remember past positive experiences and feelings. If I don't have them in this moment and can't access that, this may help me access some of that broader perspective I was talking about, appreciating the good, whether it's happening in this moment or in the past. It helps with that balance. Take in the good. This builds up positive emotional memory stores. Things like visualization, music in particular is something that I have found very helpful. Music is, they say it's the most powerful communication for emotion. And that's certainly been my experience. I listen to a cable radio show called Soundscapes. It just plays music after musical piece. And Soundscapes it's just a very calming and settling and uplifting kind of music. And I often have it just playing in the background. And it does influence and affect positively my sense of calmness and well-being. So that's something that I do quite frequently. There may be other things like being out in nature, hobbies. One of my hobbies is composing music, so I make sure I do some of that at least every month. We mentioned respite before, and here, there's again another big challenge, because if I'm to get respite, it probably means I'm going to have to be asking for additional help, even more than I'm normally asking for. If I'm already feeling on the ragged edge with what I'm asking for now, I'm not going to be very likely to ask for the additional help I might need to get some respite. So a lot of these things are kind of tied together. But it is important. In doing grief work with CAR's clients, we have this idea of dosing. Meet your grief, have a time for it, and have an end for it, and focus on something else. And it's this dosing that can help us not only move through our grief, but also take care of ourselves, because too much is not necessarily good. Relationships, very important. One of the things that, again, as I was going through the earliest months of grief after Claudia died, I began to notice what relationships I felt well-being in and what relationships I didn't. And I decided, okay, I don't have a lot of effort and energy right now. I'm going to focus on the relationships that I feel supported and uplifted by. And that was actually very helpful. Whole body awareness, things like exercise and yoga, meditation and prayer, many other ways that we can cultivate our well-being. Sometimes one just feels completely at a loss of what to do, what to say, how to help. It could be through a particular crisis. And I have found that this particular meditation can be quite helpful in that situation and in others. This is called the loving kindness meditation. And as I recite this, I'd like you to say this to yourself. And we're going to change this around. Rather than may you be happy, we'll change it around to may I be happy. So it's kind of a way of taking care of myself in this moment. May I be happy. May I be safe from harm. May I be healthy. May I be at peace. May I live with joy and ease. And just notice the energy that you have as you recite that. And of course, we can say this about our loved one. May he be happy or her be happy. We can say it about our neighbors. We can say it about our caregivers, the doctors. We can say it about the world. So that I find it helpful, particularly in a place where I'm just at my wit's end. I have nothing else that I think I can do. This is a quote I especially love from Henry Nouwen in his book Out of Solitude. This, for me, is my guiding light for providing caregiving. The one who can be present with us in our hours of grief, who can tolerate not knowing and face with us the reality of our vulnerability. That is the one that gives us our best caring. So a couple of follow-up steps that you may wish to take. First of all, there will be a link on the CFI website to this particular slide presentation and handout. And here's also a link that will be included in that to CARA's website, which has a lot of information. And if you think you may at some point need services from CARA or benefit from that, please do check out that information and contact us. There you can sign up for CARA newsletters and announcements, so whatever events are coming up you might wish to join. And then I'll include this link to Byron Katie's website, where there are all kinds of helpful forms and techniques for doing this work, and especially the videos, where people are really finding and discovering what's true about sometimes the most extremely challenging circumstances. So we have just a couple minutes, I think, for any further questions. Yes?
So where is CARA? Are you guys located in Palo Alto?
CARA is in Palo Alto. The address is 457 Kingsley Avenue. It's just off of Embarcadero.
And you were saying that some things are for fee and some is not for fee?
Yes. And
What are the differences?
well, basically, peer support is for no fee. That's for donation only. Our therapy program and the trainings and so forth are for a fee.
So group setting is free, private is private.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes, Carol?
I just have a comment about the word grief, because I heard you refer to personal and other dire situations, and it just occurred to me that grief can also be very small things. My child is sick and missed the play,
Yes.
and he was in the play. Or the test's coming up, and my child has studied hard for the test, and they can't go to school to take the test. Or I have goals to graduate myself from a certain program of study, and there are setbacks. And I just noticed that there are all types of lesser griefs that still are part of the CF community, and I like being able to apply some of your suggestions to what others might not view as monumental, but the hopes of my child to be in the play, or to walk down a stage, for instance, at graduation, or to go on a trip, or to have a dog, or whatever it is.
Yes.
If I'm feeling if I could develop the skills even on those smaller skills, at that smaller level, then I'm practicing those kindnesses to self, able to meet the regular bumps in the road of life with
Absolutely.
CF.
Yes. And when we're able to focus on those smaller initial steps, it's kindness in itself. Taking on that big one and then perhaps not feeling successful about it, that's not very kind. Yeah. Thanks, Carol. Well, I'd like to close with some thank yous. Firstly, to Carol Jenkins and to CFI, RI, for inviting me to speak this evening and for educating me a bit about CF. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and for sharing your questions and comments. And in particular, I'd like to thank friends and colleagues who are not here, who gave me support and encouragement as I prepared for this presentation. Thank you. And may you treat yourself with unconditional loving kindness.
We're here tonight at the CF Discovery Series, and we've been sharing time with Jim Mulvaney of CARA, talking about kindness to self. And we really appreciate your thoughts, which will be lingering in our minds and we'll be turning over and seeing how we can apply. Thank you very much for sharing. We do have an evaluation form for you to sign in on before you leave. We look forward to having you back with us at Crown Court Cabana Hotel for our next Discovery Series, which will be the second Tuesday in March. And we thank so much Respirotech. We have two people with us from Respirotech to update you on knowledge about what they offer, and also to Genentech for being sponsors that have helped to fund this evening for us. So great appreciation to our sponsors. Thank you all for coming.